Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of the absolute most complex geopolitical standoffs in the Middle East right now, specifically looking at exactly why Gaza disarmament remains completely stalled. We're looking at a highly anticipated ceasefire and disarmament plan that honestly seemed to be gaining real momentum, only to suddenly hit a massive, very public roadblock. The situation here is incredibly fluid, and the stakes, well, they literally could not be higher. The ripple effects of this stall impact global diplomacy and security way beyond just the Middle East. So to truly understand what's happening, we need to look past the breaking news alerts and break down the exact political gears that are grinding this entire process to a halt.
To figure out where we are right now, we really have to start with this incredibly striking statement from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. When he was presented with the U.S. president's roadmap for progressing a Gaza ceasefire agreement, Netanyahu didn't use the usual political tactics, keeping things vague or just kicking the can down the road. No, he flatly rejected it. In fact, he actually repeated himself during a cabinet meeting, saying, "I have heard people saying, you didn't say it, so here I am saying it again. Israel does not accept the 15-point document." It was an immediate, unmistakable halt to all of that momentum.
And that brings us to the core mystery of our explainer today. Just a few days prior, the U.S. president had declared that his Board of Peace had reached a historic agreement with Hamas for its complete disarmament. So why on earth would a heavily touted peace plan, backed by the United States, hit such a sudden, public brick wall? Like, what makes the Israeli prime minister take the potentially risky move of so publicly rejecting this roadmap?
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for dissecting the standoff today. First, the 15-point peace plan. Second, the disarmament deadlock. Third, the election countdown in Israel. Fourth, Hamas and weapon retention. And finally, the unheard voices.
Section 1. The 15-point peace plan, Trump's roadmap and the illusion of agreement. Let's look at what was actually proposed before we examine why it fell apart.
The core of the plan pushed by the U.S. Board of Peace involves these three mechanical steps. The board's top envoy, Nikolai Mladenov, explained that the decommissioning of weapons would need to take place in lockstep with Israeli troop withdrawals, so it's essentially a phased process. As Hamas turns in its arms, the Israeli Defense Forces, or IDF, would pull back in stages from their positions inside Gaza. Ultimately, this would pave the way for an international stabilization force to step in and oversee security. Basically, it was presented as a perfectly synchronized step-by-step dance toward peace.
Section 2. The disarmament deadlock. Lockstep versus genuine disarmament. Because here is where that synchronized dance completely falls apart. And this brilliantly illustrates the exact mechanical sticking point causing the stall. The divide is just fundamental. The U.S. envisions a lockstep withdrawal, a phased, simultaneous process. But Israel's hardline demand completely rejects that approach. They are insisting that absolutely no IDF withdrawal happens until the complete, verified disarmament of all Hamas weapons happens first. There is zero middle ground here. It's a fundamental disagreement on the basic sequencing of events.
Netanyahu made this condition incredibly explicit. He said, the IDF will not carry out any withdrawal until Hamas is disarmed. And when I say the disarming of Hamas, it means heavy weaponry, lighter weaponry, all weaponry. He's drawing a very specific hard line between what he calls fictitious disarmament and genuine disarmament. For the Israeli government, absolutely anything less than handing over every single weapon before a single troop moves is just considered unacceptable.
Now, in response to this major pushback, U.S. envoy Nikolai Mladenov actually went on Israel's Channel 12 to offer a clarification. He tried to bridge the gap by emphasizing that, hey, nobody is actually requiring Israel to act first. The revised sequence he outlined requires verified steps on the ground by Hamas first. Their weapons must be taken away, stored, and completely rendered unusable. Only after that strict verification happens would Israel then begin withdrawing from Gaza.
Mladenov also issued a really stark warning about the consequences of letting this entire plan fail. He argued that full implementation of the Board of Peace's plan is the only real guarantee against future violence, basically stating that delaying tactics will only lead to another process of rearming of Hamas and increasing the risk of another October 7th. So the stakes outlined here are incredibly high if this diplomatic deadlock can't be broken.
Section 3. Election countdown in Israel, the domestic political calculus. Let's look at why the Israeli prime minister is drawing such an unyielding line in the sand. 12. That is the number of weeks left until the Israeli general election. According to the sources, polling suggests Netanyahu remains in real political trouble. So his public rejection of the peace plan wasn't just a message meant for the U.S. or for Hamas.
It was a message spoken unequivocally directly to Israeli voters at a highly, highly critical time.
He is facing intense pressure from literally multiple angles. First, he has to maintain his fragile governing coalition, and his far-right allies have very publicly criticized the roadmap and a pilot project for that international stabilization force. But honestly, it's not just the far right. The vast majority of mainstream Israeli voters believe Israel absolutely should not have its military freedom in Gaza curtailed. Plus, Netanyahu's main political challengers, figures like Gadi Eisenkot and Naftali Bennett, they hold similarly tough stances. Adopting the U.S. plan right now would just be viewed politically as a massive sign of weakness.
Section 4. Hamas and weapon retention, survival tactics, and strategic patience. Now we need to neutrally examine the other side of this deadlock.
No, what's really interesting about this is that in a classic political maneuver, Hamas didn't escalate rhetorically in response to Netanyahu's rejection. Instead, they issued a very sober, measured statement affirming their commitment to the roadmap and calling on the U.S. Board of Peace to exert pressure on Israel. Both sides share very distinct interest in making absolutely sure the other side gets the blame for the failure of these talks.
But right beneath that measured diplomatic response lies a crucial, fundamental question raised by skeptics in the source material. Does Hamas ever genuinely intend to give up all of its weapons? Even if, by some miracle, a sequence for withdrawal could be agreed upon, would the disarmament actually happen on the ground?
According to the analysis in the sources, there is very deep doubt about this. For Hamas, weapons aren't just tools of conflict. They are the plainest manifestation of their leadership position in the Palestinian resistance. And more importantly, those weapons act as a literal guarantee of their own regime's survival. After almost 20 years in charge of the enclave, the group has made plenty of internal enemies. Giving up their arsenal entirely would leave them incredibly vulnerable to internal instability inside Gaza.
Section 5. The unheard voices, the human cost of political stalling. Ultimately, there are real-world consequences to this complex game of geopolitical chess.
The source material does actually point out a small glimmer of diplomatic activity. A U.S. official tried to highlight some recent Israeli military restraint, mentioning that there is, quote, cooperation behind the scenes and a change in targeting policy. However, this quiet tactical cooperation stands in stark contrast to the glaring reality that a comprehensive, broader peace solution is completely and totally deadlocked.
So the crucial point really comes down to this single number, 2 million. That is the number of residents living in Gaza right now. While leaders debate lockstep withdrawals, genuine versus fictitious disarmament, and stress over election poll numbers, these 2 million people are caught entirely in the middle of this massive diplomatic freeze. The sources describe this whole situation as cold comfort for the residents of Gaza. And that leaves us with a final thought to ponder as we wrap up today. As these negotiations remain totally stalled by mutual distrust, political survival, and semantic debates over sequencing, what does this continued delay actually mean for the 2 million people who are completely shut out of the conversation and entirely powerless to determine their own fate? Thank you so much for joining me to explore the realities behind the headlines.